I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, I should have said live from DC. This is the NatCon Squad. My bad, since, we're all here together for the first time ever. And it's kind of a cool opportunity to do something a little more informal. And we are here at the National Conservatism Conference, which has been in its third day and has been absolutely outstanding. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about, especially maybe in final thoughts. But first, we got plenty of good topics for you. Amber's going to kick off a discussion of the Catholic school shooting last week. Ben is going to talk about the Supreme Court ruling on the legitimacy of the tariffs. I'm going to talk about the greatly exaggerated news of President Trump's death. And finally, Inez is going to discuss the CDC vaccine schedule and the Bureaucrat whistleblowers. So, starting off with Amber.
Right. So last Wednesday, there was this really horrific Catholic school shooting in Minneapolis where a transgender individual, a man pretending to be a woman, went and shot up this Catholic school as the students were attending their daily 8:15 a.m. Mass. It was about 15 minutes into the Mass, I believe, and 2 children were killed and 18 other people were injured. We quickly learned a lot about the shooter, including the transgender identity, as well as the manifesto that came out where this person expressed very nihilistic thoughts generally, but also some specific things about feeling like they wanted to detransition, but it would be basically admitting defeat if they were to cut their hair and start identifying as a boy again. The parents had signed a legal document requesting a name change when the shooter was still a minor. And they also wrote multiple things on their weapons, idolizing other school shooters, and also saying that they wanted to kill Trump. And I know there's a lot to talk about in the aftermath, including a report today from the Daily Wire claiming that the DOJ is looking into preventing gun ownership for transgender identifying individuals. And then also the media reaction, I think, is worth talking about. We saw, of course, all of the major news outlets, mainstream media, using the shooter's preferred pronouns, identifying it as a woman, and also neglecting to mention the potential political motivations. There was, I believe it was CBS News that said that the shooter had Trump written on their gun, but didn't mention that it said kill Trump. And then finally, J.D. Vance and Second Lady Usha Vance visited Minneapolis this week to offer their prayers and condolences to the families, and were actually heckled by protesters in what was a shockingly tone-deaf moment. So I think we can take this really any direction we want, but whoever wants to jump in here, feel free.
Yeah, I was watching MSNBC in the aftermath of this, and there was this really telling moment. So first off, Jen Psaki had her whole show where she found a way to discuss what had happened, utterly failed to mention anything about the shooter being trans, talk about the problem being the massive amount of gun ownership in this country, as though that was the actual problem in this case, and that not that a crazy person had wanted to blow up, essentially kill a bunch of people at a school. But then when she transitioned into Ali Velshi's show, and they did that handoff that news anchors sometimes do, Ali said, gosh, that was such a powerful monologue, and you really explained how we should think about this. And I was like, right, how we should think. It's almost like you can tell coming from the top of the way the progressive media infrastructure works that it's not there to actually inform its viewers. It's there to impose the lens through which you are supposed to interpret any event, including one that is obviously devastating to your worldview. And I think, the Trump administration's right on here. Gender dysphoria used to be in the DSM-5. It should, or it may be in the DSM-4, I'm not sure which, but it used to be classified as a mental illness. It clearly should be. And that in and of itself would likely solve many of the problems we're dealing with, because there are many mental illnesses for which exclude you from being able to purchase a firearm.
Well, it's interesting. Before I get to that topic, right, and it's actually the opposite of interesting. You know exactly where the media is going to go with any given shooting. There's almost like a flow chart, right? Is this person, left, right, politically ambiguous? Well, if they're characterized as right-wing, right, even no matter how kind of chaotic their views, then we're going to talk about, the responsibility of the Republican Party and every person who, every politician who's Republican, everybody who's ever voted for Trump, and encouraging this atmosphere, right? We're going to go with stochastic terrorism or whatever that's called.
Politically useful,
right?
Politically inconvenient.
Yeah, exactly. And then if it's a left-wing individual, it's going to be gun control, right? Like immediately the flow chart drops down, it's gun control control. That's the problem. It's guns. It's nothing to do with this ideology. And then if it's chaotic, it can like kind of go either way if they try to blame it on Republicans or they blame it on guns. But it doesn't matter. Like the bottom of the float chart is always the same. It's Republicans' fault, whether it's directly Republicans' fault or it's Republicans' fault for not voting for gun control, right? So it's a very predictable float chart at this point. I think you've left just one important aspect out of your summary, Amber, and that's the response about prayer, which is funny
I was
for me.
just thinking about that.
To be far be it from me on this panel to be the person to bring up the anti-religious angle here, but obviously that fed into the shooter's motivations, and I'm glad we're not using his name, right? It obviously fed in to why he selected this particular target, and then there was just this pile-on from Democrats. And particularly from Gavin Newsom, who tweeted out basically like, yeah, the kids were praying while they were shot. So, parentheses, it doesn't matter if you pray or not. And this has always been such a canard because nobody is proposing, not a single person thinks that the only thing that ought to be done about school shooting is praying about it. But it's just such a mockery of the vast majority of people in this country who do believe in a higher power, who do believe in the power of prayer. And especially when the very community that is being attacked, right, the victims in this situation are turning to their religion for comfort, for the response to be so caustic and sarcastic and contemptuous. I already had a very low opinion of Gavin Newsom, obviously. He looks like a guy who would play the devil in a movie, but he's really confirming that stereotype, that sort of ghoulish stereotype. And then in terms of just the larger question, I don't know if that's something that will pass muster. You probably actually would know better than me, but I suspect this is a problem of institutions, right? Because you can't get something like the DSM manual to characterize this as a mental illness. There will be all kinds of problems with trying to take away a constitutional right that, on the basis like you will have to have some kind of diagnosis, right? There has to be some kind of due process for that kind of. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, right? Because just because somebody thinks you're crazy, right? There has to be some kind of threshold for the government to remove a fundamental constitutional right. But yeah, it's a really thorny question. Let me just add one thing, and I'll shut up. SSRIs are also part of this.
Definitely.
I'm sorry. There are a lot of these shooters are on very, very serious, even if they're not on testosterone or estrogen as part of transition, they're also on mind-altering drugs that really, really change the way that they think about the world. And that seems to be something that never gets talked about.
I'm glad you brought up the prayer issue because it was also Jen Psaki who did that on that same show, I believe, as well as the Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. And it's just a really ignorant view of religion in general, but also what prayer is for specifically. Like, no Christian believes that because you pray on a regular basis that you have a magic bubble surrounding you that prevents any harm from ever coming to you, right? Like, it's not a shield. It's not Harry Potter.
It's like a kindergarten's version.
Yes.
It is like a truly uneducated, as somebody who is not religious, it's a truly uneducated view of Christianity or of any serious religion.
Exactly. And then one other thing I wanted to mention before Ben gets to go.
No,
Apologies.
Right. Keep going.
We always do this, but if you watch, you know. But there was also a report that after the Nashville shooting, which was also committed by a transgender individual, that the private schools, including Catholic schools in Minnesota, had begged the government to allow them to get taxpayer funding for school security because right now that's only offered to public schools, and they were completely ignored for years.
There's also an ironic story here in California. I read this story or followed this story of people are being classified as mentally ill to the extent they won't identify people who are trans and let them go into the locker room that is not their sex. When the actual mentally ill act or mentally ill individuals are being implicated in horrendous shootings, we've now had a number of them already. And I think that the medications is a huge part of it. The left does not want to touch that. They don't want to touch the fact that they are fueling pathologies of people who are unstable. There are disproportionate suicide rates among people who claim to be transgender, are transitioning, et cetera.
Suicide rates key here is that they don't go down after transition. There's a great study from the Heritage Foundation showing a comparison of states where the only difference is whether or not it was allowed, like the medical transition was allowed, and the suicide. Anyway, that entire narrative has no backing to it that it actually makes suicide rates go down. This is a population that has high suicide rates, probably because it's a comorbidity of having those kinds of delusional thoughts.
And it's a sad thing. I think everyone would acknowledge it's a sad thing that you have people who have conditions, but the way that you deal with those conditions is not to perpetuate the delusion and then set society up for all of the maladies associated with it, beyond obviously genital mutilation and all the other impacts when you take this to its logical conclusion. The last thing I'd say just on the, is this to the extent this is a mental illness, does it get scheduled accordingly? And then what are the policies that follow? When you go back to When Harry Became Sally, that seminal book, he talks about the corruption of the medical establishment and why they have become captured by this ideology. And so we have an anti-institutionalization sentiment that's obviously prevailed for a really long time. And maybe the pendulum is swinging back on that. But you have the medical establishment that's also captured, and that's a really sinister part of this as well.
All right, so that's a good place to move on to the next topic, which is right back to you, Ben, on tariffs.
Right, so for something completely different, there have been a couple cases that were before the Court of International Trade, and this was sort of the tip of the spear of the effort of putatively business interests, and then I guess some states as well, to challenge the Trump emergency tariffs. And there were emergency tariffs on a couple of different justifications. One was to combat fentanyl, and the other is the economic and national security impacts of having these massive trade deficits in perpetuity and the pernicious policies that other governments have pursued against us and trying to right them via use of the IEEPA, this Emergency Powers Act, to impose these tariffs. And obviously, this has been a hugely successful effort for America in the way of negotiating trade agreements that are massively in our favor, security agreements, et cetera, and restructuring an entire architecture that has been pointed right at America's jugular, basically, for decades. So you had these couple cases, the one before the Court of International Trade. The plaintiffs in those cases prevailed against the Trump administration. The Trump administration appealed. It went to a federal circuit appellate court, which for, I think, sort of different reasons, but still agreed with the conclusions of the lower courts. And now you have the Trump administration who has basically filed an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court and wants the Supreme Court to validate the administration's view of the IEEPA, which is that, first of all, it's the president's prerogative to say whether the circumstances are such that there is an emergency. And there's exact language on that, which we can go into, and the lawyers can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But it says that the IEEPA authorizes the president to exercise certain powers to deal with, quote unquote, any unusual and extraordinary threat. And I think that the appellate court agrees that there is an extraordinary or unusual threat here. And basically their beef with the administration was, well, these tariffs are too extreme. Tariffs don't count, despite the fact that the administration under the IEEPA can impose policies that deal with importing goods, et cetera. And then there was an argument about major questions doctrine, that if Congress wanted the president to be able to have these authorities, then it would have laid it out very clearly because the magnitude of these is so great. And basically the administration says, Solicitor General John Sauer writes to the Supreme Court, I think a really compelling initial brief, essentially, calling for a petition for writ of cert, where basically like, this is exactly what the IEEPA was created for. There's an unusual and extraordinary threat that the president identified. Congress didn't say you can't impose tariffs. It actually lays out all of these freedoms that the administration does have to grapple with a massive problem. And so they want the Supreme Court to answer this quickly because the administration claims there's going to be economic catastrophe, even setting aside the now sort of stalling, indecision, and even effectively helping the negotiators on the other sides of these deals when you have the courts intervening on behalf of these plaintiffs. So this is another sort of meta battle that is, does the president have this power or not? What powers do the courts have? When Congress writes something that's very open-ended and broad, doesn't that mean that those powers flow to the president? And we're talking about national security here as well. So this is one of a series of battles that are analogous, but it's obviously hugely significant because we're talking about trillions of dollars in commerce here. So I'd open it up to the group. What do you make of one thing is like the left's tactic of using the Court of International Trade to go at the administration. And then where do you think the Supreme Court lands? Worth noting that the government, which is the Trump administration, and the plaintiffs agree that they want the Supreme Court to expedite this quickly and get to a resolution, I think in November probably.
Yeah, so I think, I'm not sure this is even the left. This is like Ilya Somin and some of the George Mason libertarians who are fighting against the tariffs. I think the first point is a meta point, which is if you go with this theory that says that the president can only respond in individualized cases to individualized tariffs, you blow up his ability to negotiate tariff agreements permanently, basically. And then what can happen is, we have a series, what's to stop any of these countries from reimposing the tariffs they had before on us, which we just negotiated.
Congress will step in.
Right. Well, Congress will step in. Oh, they will? I mean, I think that's kind of why Congress ceded this authority to the president in the first place. I'm pretty sure that that's the rationale for having these laws and centralizing tariff authority and negotiating authority in the presidency and the executive branch, because they're the ones that can effectively represent. A Congress can't represent the country in negotiations with foreign powers. The president can, and the president does. So I don't think it makes any sense to say that these tariffs, which are the product of these external negotiations, can be disturbed by the courts because Congress didn't approve them, unless you're trying to make an argument that these are like treaties and somehow we need to. But I don't think that quite works because, the idea of, trade negotiations are so temporary. They aren't like permanent treaties that last forever. And tariff rates have these time periods, and there's nothing binding our adversaries to the treaty in the same way that we aren't. So therefore, we shouldn't be bound in the same way. So none of this really makes any sense, and I think the Supreme Court will see it that way. I saw something that even though this view won 7-4 in the federal circuit, it won the majority of the Trump appointees to the federal circuit. And I think the Supreme Court will look at this long and hard and realize that this is a bad world where the judiciary is vetoing presidentially negotiated tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to note, first of all, is the major questions doctrine. Right? It's interesting how different this posture will be than most of the major questions doctrine cases, right? Because most of the major questions doctrines cases are directly about agencies. And while we have this fiction that the executive agencies are run by the president, that hasn't been the way that the executive branch has operated for some time. So usually the major questions doctrine is like the EPA interpreting a piece of legislation saying, okay, like this is how we interpret it. And then the courts coming in and saying, well, that is our job to interpret legislation, right? And we think that this is touching something that went beyond what Congress is saying. Here is directly the president, and it's in the foreign policy context. It's almost like trying to draw an analogy between the president's wartime powers in a way where they are at their zenith, right? But this is kind of a similar situation where it is lifetime negotiation with foreign adversaries in some cases. I think there's a stronger argument here than there is in many other of the major questions doctrine cases, right? Because you have directly the president acting, and because this is in the context of foreign relations. I guess I'm a little more cautious about which way the Supreme Court will come out on this. I think probably this would be a really good case if somebody like even Gorsuch or Barrett, and certainly like Kavanaugh, who would like to establish the bipartisan nature of the major questions doctrine. This is a court that is chipping in, I think, in very positive ways, right? Slowly chipping away at administrative power. And this might be like a good feather in their cap to say, no, we also rule against the Trump administration in these cases. So I wouldn't be super optimistic about the Supreme Court.
Just
cases.
one comment that occurred to me when you're talking about agencies versus the president himself. It's actually very logically consistent from the perspective of the president's enemies. Right. The agencies have power and the president has no power.
No power, right. It's like the agencies are, theoretically, right, when they file briefs in court, it is the federal government speaking, right, with the authority of the elected president. But we know that de facto that's not true. And that's why this court is advancing a more a major questions doctrine with more teeth. Like that is the idea behind it. So this posture is almost backwards.
Well, and there's a funny story that came out today directly to that point, which is there was some mainstream media outlet, and I can't remember which one it was, that was complaining that the Pentagon is allowing like Trump's troops to stage at one of their Navy facilities outside of Chicago before he sends in the National Guard. And it's like, do you think that the Navy is just like not under the authority of the commander in chief?
I think they do. When it's a Republican
they really,
president,
they
do.
really were pretending that the Navy is some like amorphous, independent organization outside of the executive branch. It was incredible.
It's worse than that. They defended Milley, right?
Right.
Making a direct call
Yes.
to China in contravenance of what the president of the United States. Civilian control over the military is the most fundamental norm or Rubicon of like civic society of Republicans.
I can't help but think we're like in the middle of like the Japanese Empire again or something, where you have the Navy and the Army fighting it out independently, and the civilian leadership is sitting in the corner being like, "Whatever you guys want." You know, that's not how our system works.
And there was another article today, and maybe one of y'all remembers which outlet this was in, but a bunch of federal judges.
NBC News. I was going to talk about this at the end, but go
I mean,
for it.
I think it fits here because we have a huge case going to the Supreme Court and multiple others as well. But yes, these anonymous federal judges just attacking the Supreme Court. Like the fact that NBC granted them anonymity to do that in the first place is just mind-bogglingly insane. But then also the fact that they would do that is crazy. And amazingly, though, in the article, aside from them all bashing the Supreme Court and Trump, one of them admits that in the federal judiciary, Trump derangement syndrome is real. It's like, well, yes, we know, but thank you for actually admitting it, I guess.
I almost want to talk about that instead of my topic. I mean, I guess we could. Well, maybe we'll talk about both. Whatever.
We'll talk about it more in the final thoughts.
More in final thoughts. Fine. All right. Well, anyway, so I guess we'll right now pivot back to me and talking about the greatly exaggerated news of Trump's demise that came over the weekend. Trump didn't do a news conference for a couple days, and the left decided he was dead. That was the essential thing, and it's one of the most brazen attempts to. I have no idea what they're doing. Maybe they're just projecting this internalized and unspoken guilt they have over not speaking out about Joe Biden's obvious infirmity. They had, we had 4 years of a president who could barely speak in public. There's a whole book written by Jake Tapper. I don't know, I actually read it. It was really interesting. But everybody knew, and everybody was keeping a massive conspiracy of silence, that the guy was completely non-compos mentis, couldn't remember people, couldn't string a sentence together, had to be escorted everywhere he was going. They were terrified he was going to fall. They started having him walk out with huge numbers of people around him so the problems of his gait wouldn't be obvious. And then all of a sudden, Trump takes 2 days off of press conferences, and the left's like, oh, he must be dead. Yeah, give me a break. What is wrong with you people? And I think it captures something about... I think the left is pretty demoralized right now. I think that's what this is a function of. There's sort of, Trump has his second term. They're not going to be able to get rid of him. He's not running again, so there's no, let's beat Trump in 2028. He'll be gone. So it's just, they're not sure what to be mad about or angry about, and so they're just, looking for some sort of deus ex machina to save them. In this case,
they're mad because there are no more bums at Union Station.
Right. Oh, yeah. What else? Yeah. What else are they mad about? Yeah. There's too little crime. So they don't have an idea of what they actually want to be saying. So it's the hope of a deus ex machina to solve their political problem.
I think that's exactly what it is. It's those two things. One is trying to turn the Biden narrative around on Trump and Republicans, and then also just trying to instill some kind of hope in the Democratic Party. But it was especially hilarious seeing this start to circulate on Friday because I was at the White House on Friday. Me and my colleague Reagan Reese were there. She was about to do a Trump interview. So we were sitting just outside of the Oval Office. I heard the man's voice. You can hear him talking through the door. He's blasting Les Mis and a bunch of 80s hits in the Rose Garden on his speakers, like having a dance party, I guess, just outside of the Oval. And she went in and interviewed him for over an hour. And maybe an hour or less after she left the Oval Office and after I heard his voice and his songs, his Spotify playlist, there were these rumors spreading around X that he was dead. And I was like, well, he certainly didn't drop dead in the past hour since we left the White House. And then when we started saying, well, we just interviewed him at the Daily Caller, it was, well, we can't trust the Daily Caller. That's a rag. They're probably lying to cover for Trump. The most insane conspiracy theories, just classic blue and on nonsense.
No, it's projection, right?
Yeah.
Daily Caller is covering for Trump being dead. Well, the entire media covered for Biden being almost dead.
That accusation does make sense because they would do that, and they did.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, I mean, this is totally ridiculous. They also have all those pictures of his hand, like maybe he got an IV or something, and like he's got bruising on
As
his
does
hand.
every 22-year-old woman who's hungover in college now,
Yeah.
apparently. Like, you can order IV services to your house now.
I don't look. I mean, Trump is a relatively old guy. I can't. There's no way to say this without it coming off as completely toady, and just kissing the hem of like the robe. But this is just an honest observation. I am actually shocked. All the things I said about Biden. Oh, he's running circles around everybody. I am really impressed with the guy's stamina. He's like in his 80s, right? And he is not quite
79.
79. Like, his schedule would make me tired. Maybe it's just because I have the baby at home. I don't know. But he genuinely seems to be somebody who has a ton of energy. That doesn't mean he won't drop dead, like he is on the actuarial table, right? It's a problem of gerontocracy and having, in his case, he's the silent generation, right? He's the last running everything still. But yeah, this is just like pure psychological projection. Maybe it is just like latent guilt for covering up over this. They have to project all of their particular sins. I'm not saying the right has no sins, but they have to project all of their particular sins on the right as though like this is, I don't know. There's something psychological to be said here.
I think there's projection. There is a totally false and disingenuous effort to overcorrect for never covering Joe Biden. But of course, if there was a single thing wrong with Donald Trump, the man who is out there more transparent than any person you've ever seen, who takes questions from people who hate his guts 3 hours a day and gives scoops to people who hate his guts even, and then goes to golf for 4 hours and then comes back and then does some more questions and then does trade negotiations, etc. If there was a single thing wrong with the man, you don't think that the press would be reporting that out in a second? So they have to make up because they don't see him for like 5 minutes of time that the man's on his deathbed.
No, this just reminds me, the press flip around reminds me of that old Soviet joke, which is just about, like the U.S. has freedom of speech because I can go to Times Square in the 60s and say F Kennedy. And then like the Soviet says, well, I too have freedom of speech because I can go to the middle of Red Square and say F Kennedy, right? Like this is
I should mention here too that I in retrospect, I realized I saw this conspiracy being generated in real time because as we were standing in lower press before we got called up to sit outside the Oval, the pool reporter who was on duty that day came into lower press and was sort of frantically asking, like, what is Trump doing today? There's no public events on his schedule. What's happening? And then she sent out a pool report based on what they told her, which was, I think he had a phone call in the morning and a media interview in the afternoon. And she mentioned, like, I'm trying to find out more details. And she came back like 3 different times, just pumping the press team for information about where he was. And I'm like, okay, so you're either scrolling through Blue Sky or one of these other reporters has told you that people are talking about the president being dead. And now you feel it's your, a moral obligation to go figure out exactly who he's interviewing with to make sure that he's still alive.
I do think that there is something conspiratorial on the left where they think he's unwell or they're just waiting for some kind of condition that they can pounce on, which is just so sick and twisted and ghoulish. I mean, look, it makes sense. They wanted to lock the guy up. There were plenty of people, cheering on the assassination attempts, et cetera. So and I'm not trying to paint a broad brush on everyone on the Democrat side, but I do think there is an element of wish casting on their side, which is deeply disturbing and un-American and anti-American.
And Tim Walz basically did that in response to the conspiracy.
I will add one sort of serious level to this, which is, to your point about the wish casting, they still believe that if Trump disappears, that all his voters will disappear too. They're imagining an America without Trump and anyone who supports Trump.
Yeah, and I don't think that would go well. These people seem to have not thought hard about what President J.D. Vance would do. Like, do they think this would be an improvement for Democrat morale? Or, maybe it would improve Democrat morale, but it certainly would improve policy outcomes from a Democrat perspective. No chance. And are we? Yeah, I think we're fine. We can just move on to the next one and just extend final thoughts, I think. All right, so next, I think, this is actually something I'd like to spend even more time talking about, the CDC mess, and Inez can talk about that.
Yeah, there's like a bunch of it that's come in just today. And so RFK Jr. is testifying in Congress. He had a bunch of back and forths with, among others, Elizabeth Warren. I mean, he just laid out all of the mistakes that public health made during COVID to a silent room, which is always fun. But then this comes on the heels of 1,000 people in the CDC and in HHS trying to sign a petition to get him fired, when in fact probably the opposite thing should happen. And then this is all on the heels, and I'm pulling this up because it's a Greek name that I can't pronounce.
Demeter Daskalakis.
There
Well
we
done.
go. But there's this guy who resigned very publicly from the CDC, and he's going around on doing the media circuit. This should feel very familiar to those of us who remember Anonymous before Vindman became the face of that, right? This is sort of the face of the deep state. And it is remarkable to me, as somebody who is truly somewhat, I should mention, this is all about potentially rejiggering the CDC recommended vaccine schedule for children, right? And it's like, just as somebody who is, I think, a true sort of both moderate and is very uncertain or doesn't have a high degree of certainty about these questions, especially as a parent, it's amazing how this guy who's making the rounds is the perfect foil for everything, all the reasons why people can no longer trust public health. He's out there saying, RFK isn't going to stop with the COVID shot. He's going to look at the Hep B shot for children for all newborns. Well, if you look into, and again, I gave my children plenty of vaccines. This was one that I didn't, just transparently, because if you look into it, this is a disease that is transferred to newborns. Forget about, older people, about teenagers, adults who may possibly be using drugs or having sex, right? This is something that newborns do not transfer around their kindergartens, right? Like the method of transmission for young children is from mothers who have untreated Hep B to children. And so this guy on MSNBC admits directly, says, we do this because there is a percentage of children who will be born with this and have horrible consequences because their mothers have this untreated virus, right? And he says, this is what's going to come off next. But he admits in his actual analysis that this is not an individualized risk assessment, that this is spreadsheet brain, right? This is something that we give every single newborn in the United States because we can't be sure that drug users and prostitutes are going to do prenatal care where they test you for this. Right? And it is the weakest case possible. And then you find out on top of that, this guy has a Instagram feed full of BDSM bondage gear. He goes to gay orgies. That's apparently low risk behavior, but somebody who's concerned about the individualized risk assessment for their child or something that it is the perfect blend of the deep state claiming, and these public health officials claiming, a credibility that they have completely lost. And not only do they not acknowledge that they've lost it, they just keep doubling down on an empty well of credibility instead of sitting down with people as though they're actually, oh my God, gasp, reasonable adults who you could talk through a risk assessment, a pro and con with. They're just, basically doubling down on everybody who objects to the public health spreadsheet brain decisions of somebody who thinks gay orgies are a good risk benefit in terms of public health. Then, you're just an anti-vax conspiracy theorist. They're just completely doubling down on an empty well. I don't know. There's a lot there. There's a ton more from RFK's hearings. There's a ton about the resignations. There's something to be said about, once again, being able to fire people in the federal government, which is ridiculously difficult, and the president seizing that authority back to actually control the executive branch. Any of that is fair game.
Well, I think this guy was also Biden's monkeypox czar, right? So
Yes.
He's engaging in the exact behaviors that led to the spread of monkeypox, and yet was trusted to lead the government's public health
and
response.
said those behaviors were not worth curtailing.
Right.
In direct contradiction to, I don't know, going to church or seeing your dying grandmother during COVID.
Sure. Instead, trying to get everyone to get a monkeypox vaccine.
And this is one of those cases where, the science was very clear. The spread was very much primarily among homosexual males, and the way to stop it. I mean, there was a great article written by a gay writer, Ben Ryan, at the time, who was like, yeah, the gay community, with the spread of this disease, we should be engaging in more restrained sexual practices in order to not get infected. And the CDC guy, who's nominally supposed to stop this, right, and help prevent disease spread, was like, no, we can't possibly stigmatize behavior at all, or risk stigmatizing it by suggest that there's a temporary public health reason to engage in more restrained behavior. And more to the point, or kind of going back a little bit, this is a guy, he was wearing BDSM like pentagrams, satanic stuff. And in what planet does the CDC think, yes, the person, given that widespread adoption of vaccines is important, and you have to be broadly credible with the general public, that a guy wearing BDSM satanic bondage gear in public was an appropriate messenger for vaccine safety? Like, what's wrong with you? And, they want to go after RFK, and I'm just sitting here, and as someone who's generally pro-vaccine, thinking, you've lost all your credibility. You've so distant from what the average American thinks and from average Americans' beliefs that you think that they ought to take the word of someone wearing satanic tattoos seriously.
I think, though, it's an illustration of their contempt, though, for the public, that they would put out the worst possible illustration of what the public health bureaucrat ought to look like in this particular situation. I don't even know that it's a lack of self-awareness, although it could be a lack of self-awareness. I think that it is actually shoving the American people's faces in it. I mean, sort of like during COVID, when you go back to the governors who locked down their jurisdictions and they went to go vacation in Florida. It's a similar, rules for thee, not for me sort of perspective. And then there's also the aspect of, to the point about like the spreadsheet-driven world, and we're going to impose this worldview on you based upon this, technocratic analysis that we put together. That is progressivism. Progressivism, like when you look back 100+ years, they said we can manage society, we can mold society, and there's actually a scientific basis for it. And the public health establishment is like the most natural manifestation in some ways of where that progressive ideology takes you. But the disaster of it, of course, is that this is the one place where you can't have politics and ideology pervading it. And instead, like all of our other seminal institutions in the places where you cannot have that corruption of the politics, it's been wholly corrupted to our great detriment, because you need doctors and you need a medical field, and it ought to be the envy of the world. This is actually a field where
expertise is, like, real expertise is important. I know that we all say we can do our own research, but actually reading medical research and understanding, like, balancing some of these risks, and it actually does take an expertise, and it is a great loss to the country that we can no longer, quote unquote, trust the experts on this. This is not like governance or judgment. A lot of this is like very dense scientific material that is actually, there is a role for expertise, but they have shot themselves in the foot, and then they're blaming. It's like that meme where they the guy shoots the other guy in the chair and says, why would somebody else do this? Like, they pissed away their credibility completely. And not only do they not acknowledge that they have done that, their posture is still like contemptuous of anyone who questions them, as though the people who question them weren't right about every important aspect of COVID.
Yeah, if you're actually a person who is broadly pro-vaccine and thinks vaccines are helpful, you should be furious with the CDC, furious with this idiotic doctor who thinks that it's wise to put himself out there as the face of vaccine adoption and vaccine safety. I mean, and I guess I might qualify myself among them. I think vaccines have done a lot of good for the world. I think measles, there's a lot of diseases that basically are gone because of technological advancements and the widespread adoption of vaccines that have eliminated those diseases from our world. And so to see this guy prancing around and lecturing, wearing his pentagram BDSM gear while lecturing average Americans on how dare they be so silly as to not get vaccines is infuriating. And I mean, he's doing about as much damage. I mean, it's more appalling than Fauci, I think. It's just because it's so glaringly obvious that he shouldn't be doing what he's doing.
It's kind of like when they put a guy who was stealing women's dresses from the airport in charge of nuclear security.
Or just a transgender.
Oh, right.
In charge of, yeah, right. Rachel
right.
Levine. What position did Rachel Levine have? The guy who...
Yeah, it was like...
The admiral.
Admiral. The first 4-star female admiral. It was really quite an accomplishment.
It was impressive how he was wearing 2 costumes.
And just to bring this full circle,
right,
one of the other things that RFK has done recently that has really angered the liberals is he announced an investigation into exactly what we were talking about in regards to the Minneapolis shooting, which is the linkage between SSRIs and school shootings. And the mainstream media, the Democrats, were furious about this because they are huge proponents of the overprescription and the over-medicalization of tough feelings.
That's really true. I think we can kind of move to we're close enough. We can move to final thoughts. And I think, can we do more conversationally? Because like whatever, we're here, right? Let's just talk about this stuff. I wanted to talk about the thing you brought up earlier, which was the fact that you had this article of like 14 lower court judges, leaking or like going off the record to the Atlantic, I believe it was.
It was NBC News.
NBC News, going off the record to NBC News to complain about how meany and how unfortunate it is that the Supreme Court isn't having their back and isn't giving them clearer guidance on what they expect them to do.
And someone is going to die if the Supreme Court doesn't have their back.
Oh my God.
Who was the author of the article? Do you all know?
I don't remember.
We should find out. I'm curious.
We can do this in real time.
Yeah.
Right. The arrogance of the current set of lower court judges is astonishing. Somebody pointed out that when it comes to this sort of Article 3 versus Article 2 conflict, there actually are these competing interests and competing balanced sovereignties, where these are co-equal branches of government. So there's a respect that's supposed to be accorded, and then Article 2 is going to push back on Article 3 with its own prerogatives and vice versa. But there is no such balance between the Supreme Court and the lower courts. The lower courts are beneath the Supreme Court. They report to the Supreme Court.
Inferior courts
they are inferior
in the Constitution.
And yet they are just not willing to take direction in terms of vertical stare decisis. And they see the problem of the limited guidance they're being given. The limited guidance is because there's such a vast rebellion by the lower courts that the Supreme Court is overwhelmed dealing with this, playing whack-a-mole, trying to get these lower courts in line.
Can we just call this what it is? It's total BS, because even in the cases where the Supreme Court gives them a decision back-to-back on the same thing 2 weeks apart, they're like, oh, no, I need more guidance.
Or they ignore it, like in, was it in Massachusetts?
Yeah, right. Like they ruled that they put a stay on the injunction forcing them, that was trying to withhold funds. And then the same district court judges were like, well, you stayed my injunction, but you didn't stay my remedial order. So the remedial order is still in place. So that still
I'm not
means the
touching
money.
you.
Yeah. Like, yeah, right. Like, it's just.
Actually, because we're at NatCon, I really want to recommend when all these, I don't know which ones are up and which ones aren't, but from Tuesday, the panel that I chaired, James Burnham had a great talk about exactly this issue. Mm-hmm. I thought it was really, really clear. And then Josh Blackman also like following up specifically on the rebellion of these lower courts. But I thought that James's talk on this was just so clear about exactly what you opened with this, Will. Right? There are co-equal branches of government. There are actually really kind of delicate and something that could legitimately be called the constitutional crisis when there's a standoff between the courts and the president, or the courts and Congress, right? These are actual legitimate constitutional crises where you have opposition between two co-equal branches of government and no clear way to resolve that in our system other than a direct recourse of the people in an election, right? So there are these like very heavy questions. Like, this is not that.
Yeah.
This is not that.
Infra-branch.
Yeah,
this is just one branch at war with itself. That said, I do think, and it's interesting because a day before this, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, there were a ton of nomination hearings. And he said, he addressed this very issue, actually. He said, basically, like, the Democrats are saying, well, the Trump administration is threatening not to follow a court order, and the administration has followed all the orders, even the terrible orders. And he says, following the rule of law means obeying lawful court orders, but we now have lower court judges who aren't following court orders. And that's exactly what Justice Gorsuch has said recently, because the Supreme Court constantly has to smack down the lower courts. Now, one of the arguments that's made by these anonymous, and we're going to have more anonymous now, but anonymous judges.
And then when they become not anonymous, you'll find their Instagram with the pentagram BDS.
When are they going to start writing books about like the poor anonymous judge fighting bravely against the evil Supreme Court, and trying to save democracy from the evils of John Roberts or something?
Like they say that these are tersely written opinions and they want more, and so like I can appreciate that. I'd like the Supreme Court sometimes to elaborate more as well, because it leaves open the opportunity for the lower court mischief to continue potentially if they aren't very explicit and detailed, et cetera. But I do think they are trying to appeal to Chief Justice Roberts' sense of, I need to defend the institution. And he's gone out there, along with some of the other justices, and been defending the Supreme Court, from the left kind of perspective of, we hear all this criticism of us, and consequently, I would argue that Chief Justice Roberts has made a bunch of political calls, which he would say are actually about defending the institution, but are really political. So I do think they are potentially, if they're not all just like theater kids, which some of them are, including at least one Supreme Court justice, at the end of the day, literally, I do think there's a strategy here, which is we want to make Justice Roberts deadly afraid of continuing to rule as he is, leading the court in a way that might actually help Trump, i.e. actually accord with the Constitution. And so I do think that this is more than just the insane rantings of TDS adult judges. There is that here, and we see that obviously in the lower court insanity, the insurrection that's going on. But there's a bigger point here, I do think, and we've seen some other judges also sort of speak out about attacks on the court. You're threatening the institution of the court, and that's where Roberts gets very concerned. So I do think there's more to this than just this insane proposition that, well, a lower court judge is going to get assassinated if the Supreme Court keeps ruling 6-3 or 5-4 in Trump's favor.
Yeah, I didn't hear the complaining when there was like all this stuff going on about Kavanaugh. Those lower court judges weren't leaking to the NBC News when an assassin literally sat outside Justice Kavanaugh's house.
I wanted to talk about, if we're good to move on, the updates on the DC crime situation, since we are in DC for NatCon. And
what crime?
I know, there's no crime. No, it's actually incredible. So I have a spreadsheet of the Metropolitan PD crime statistics from this 2-week period. It's like basically the first 2 weeks of Trump's takeover in 2023, 2024, and then in 2025. And the claim, of course, was, well, crime is already going down in D.C., but it's amazing to look at, yes, there's a decrease between 2023 and 2024. It's still not to where it was prior to the pandemic, and one of the big problems with D.C. crime is that it's so random now. I mean, basically all of the things that you would do to reduce your risk factor of becoming a victim of crime in D.C. are sort of irrelevant now because you can just be carjacked on M Street in Georgetown. But there's a massive drop between 2024 and 2025 in that 2-week period when Trump took over and federalized the situation. 86% lower carjackings. It's like between the 60s and 70% decrease for everything from assault to murder, rapes, retail theft, like all of these categories, just a massive decrease. And I know just all of us personally have probably felt the difference. Ben, I think you're still based in DC, right?
I'm in the New York area. Actually,
you're in New York now.
Yeah,
and
for better or worse.
And as you lived in DC for a long time, Will, you lived in DC for a long time. We're all familiar with DC, right? We've spent plenty of time here. Just walking around now, not only is it safer, but it's cleaner. And as you notice that there are a lot fewer bums, which is especially in Union Station, which was a hot spot.
You're right that the big spike, the massive spike in crime, obviously with most of the cities, right, happens in 2020, 2021 into 2022, and then there's somewhat of a tapering off, leaving a much higher crime rate than was there in 2018 or 2019, right? I came to DC for the first time in 2011. I have never seen Union Station with 0 bums. And for those of you who are in the Washington area, the corner with the post office museum, 0 bums. 0. There were none. I have never seen that even at the peak of the so-called like the best years of Washington, D.C. in terms of safety and crime. It has never happened. Now, I'm not saying like I'm sure that you could go to Union Station at some point and see a bum, but the difference is stark and immediate, and you see it like immediately getting off. And to the point about New York and everything, it'll be really interesting because New York is generally 10 times more or less. It's easy because there's an order of magnitude difference between the number of people in DC and versus New York. So you can really compare stats very easily. And right now, New York is about 10 times safer than Washington, D.C. was before. Now you have New York apparently having to learn a lesson again about public safety and crime after a mayor, which, by the way, I have an article, an essay out in Tablet just today about, I just don't understand why people hate Eric Adams so much because he has been a great mayor in that regard. He really has restored public safety in New York. But we'll see what these two cities essentially like are going to cross paths. But I'm jealous as a New Yorker. This was one of the things that I liked about moving to New York. I was like, okay, finally, I don't feel like if I go to a nice restaurant, I might have to duck under the seat, which happens all the time. There was all this denial about the crime problem. Diplomat in DC, one of these fancy Tony restaurants for people who work in both, Republican and Democratic administrations. People have to dive beneath the seats. It's happened multiple times because of shots exchanged across 14th Street. DC is a wildly violent city, or has been, and it feels totally transformed. And I will just end this one. It makes me angry because it was so easy.
Yeah.
It was so easy.
There's this the great meme that floats around on X, which is like, it's a switch that says fix everything easily switch. And then there's a whole bunch of quotes around it that's like, how dare you even think about flipping the switch? What are you, some crazy switch flipper? Like, who would do such a thing? Like, crime is a choice. We don't actually have to tolerate crime. You can use law enforcement resources. I see some leftists going out there and, they post on Twitter, they post pictures of law enforcement standing around with nothing happening. They're like, oh man, these guys are just wasting their time. What do you think law enforcement in a peaceful city looks like?
That shows it's working.
That shows it's working. It's the police standing around reminding everybody that the area is safe. I'm happy every time I see a police officer. I feel safe anytime I see a police officer. That is their job, and it's a lot more pleasant to be doing that job than to trying to like track down some guy in an ATV who's just run over some old lady. So it's really ridiculous.
And they found so many illegal aliens in this time period too. I think they've caught like 50, and including some gang members.
Oh, but they're not able to come forward and be witnesses now because they're afraid they'll get deported, right?
Right.
That's what we're told as a result of all this.
Did you see the wailing and gnashing from some of the? So I still am subscribed to neighborhood blogs in Washington D.C. or whatever, and the what is that blog about? It's like Prince of Petworth or something, right? It was just an old subscription of mine, but they're talking about how are you dealing with this crackdown? Do you feel guilty when you order your burrito taxi with your Uber driver to your door? Because what if he's illegal and he gets caught by ICE while he's delivering your burrito?
Good.
And then like all of the white rich liberals in Washington D.C. are agonizing over this moral choice about whether or not they can order takeout.
It's so true though. So there are these literal moped
so
gangs around DC, and apparently they're like all Tren de Aragua. They're like all Venezuelan gang members. And I have not seen the moped gangs in weeks. There's a huge congregation right near my office. Have not seen them. Good. Kill DoorDash at the same time as we deport the illegals. I think it would be great for society.
You might have to walk to your burrito place.
God forbid.
Or God forbid you cook.
RFK will be happy with you.
Anyway, like most of America does. Anyway, so that's going to do it for us. On behalf of Inez, Bamber, and Ben, thanks for watching NatCon Squad Live the first time ever. And we'll see you next time.